Hi, thank you all for coming. This is our author talk with Elon Green. Elon Green is here to discuss his book, Last Call. Oh, I want to get it without getting any, there, can you see it without the, there? That's,
well, mine doesn't have the plastic on it, so you're not going to get it.
oh, okay. Thank you, Elon. Thank you. Last Call, the true story of love, lust, and murder in queer New York. It is quite a book. It is a history piece about the 1990s when AIDS was rampant and the gay community experienced anti-gay violence that could be construed as ignored. David Gran writes, "This is much more than a compelling true crime story. Elon Green has shed light on those whose lives for too long have been forgotten and rescued. It's an important part of American history." The story is about, in the 1990s, gay men were preyed upon in a local bars in New York City and then killed by a lone serial killer. And the story really didn't make the headlines, or I lived in New York City sort of in that time frame. I don't remember it being something that was talked about, but Elon found out about it, and in a little while we'll talk with him about how he came upon all this information to write this book. Elon has written for the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, and the Columbian Journalism Review, and he appears in the true crime anthology Unspeakable Acts, of which the library does own. He has been an editor at Longform since 2011. He is here with his parents, Diane and Hank Green, who worked with him on the editing of this big book. I welcome all of you to the author talk at New Canaan Library. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to start with Elon, if I may. Elon, how did you, since this was such an ignored kind of a crime that really wasn't reported upon, though it must have been, but it was pretty quiet. How did you come about finding out about it?
Pretty much by accident. Was sort of buried in a cover story about anti-gay violence in an issue of The Advocate in 1994. And, you know, I did a few Google searches just to figure out what the case was and discovered that there was very little information on it.
I mean, during all this time, Jeffrey Dahmer was taking over all the news. There was a killer out in San Francisco. And so do you think that this was something that when you were doing your investigations, reading through a lot of transcripts, did you find that this was being ignored or being suppressed in any way? I mean, what do you think was happening that it just didn't get known?
I mean, I don't think it was being ignored. You know, it was written about to some degree in New York City and Philadelphia, Boston, Westchester County. But it, you know, in hindsight, it doesn't seem like it was getting the attention that I think the case probably deserved. But also, you know, this was happening when the homicide rates were at near peaks in New York City. And so even though they were getting some attention, they weren't getting enough attention that they would have really been noticeable at the time. I think it was a New York Daily News editor who said to me that, you know, there could be 4 bodies found in a lot in the Bronx, and, you know, that probably wouldn't even rate a headline.
So there were a lot of other crimes happening that was just so much crime.
I mean, I think in 1990, there were 2,245 murders in New York City.
Wow. And
so, I mean, in hindsight, you know, the fact that it got written about as much as it did is kind of a surprise.
now, in the book, you had written about how the police departments, okay, so the murders, just to let you guys know, the attendees who have maybe not read the book already, the murders were quite gruesome. It was called the last call murder because the murderer would attend bars that were notoriously serving to gay communities, and it was always at the last call, when the last call for drinks or food or whatever had been made, that he would then sort of sidle up to another person, and they would leave together. And in many instances, not all, but in many of the instances, that person would then be killed, and that person would be found in various places in bits and pieces. Not a pretty scene for a lot of the Department of Public Works, who had to find them in barrels along highways or some places. Because of that, the murders were happening, the bodies were being found, some in New Jersey, some in Pennsylvania, some up in upstate New York. So you had different jurisdictions. Elon, how long did it take for these jurisdictions to finally see that they were all, I mean, were they all talking with one another at the same time, or did they have to find each other to finally say, oh, there is a killer? And then they found out that the killing was happening in New York City, out of their jurisdiction. What was that kind of finding in your research?
Lack of communication wasn't actually a problem in this case. Because the detectives, because the crimes were unusual, the detectives always filled out what are called VICAP forms, which they're these, pretty detailed questionnaires, basically, about violent crimes. And they're entered into an FBI database and then are kept there. And, when a distinctive murder or violent crime happens, detectives will have the FBI check this database to see if there's any, similar cases already on the books. And after the second murder in 1992, detectives already knew that there was a similar case the year before. So on that, that wasn't really an issue.
And so when you were talking, just to let people know, Elon sat with me and a number of emerging writers, people who are learning to the ins and outs of the writing craft. And Elon was teaching them how to interview someone for a book or for a report or something like that. And what you brought up was interesting in that you had talked to, because of the extensiveness of all of these just different jurisdictions, you really had to talk with a lot of different people about, all the different crimes that they were reporting on in the different areas. And you said you did over 160 interviews. Did they all start to sound the same, or did they have differences? Or,
No, everybody had a different story to tell, even if they were working the same case. They all concentrated on different things, and sometimes their stories reinforced each other and sometimes they didn't. But they always added, a certain nuance to the overall story.
And so when you were constructing the book, you were kind of doing you decided to do a timeline of the first person that was killed. That was Peter Anderson.
Yeah, I just did a 30-page timeline of the events as near as I could discern them.
But then it ended up in Maine with something that had happened. You ended sort of toward the end of the book about a murder that had happened, not really of the same, but it had happened earlier than
Right.
Anderson's. And that was, can you just talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, this was a murder in 1973 on near the campus of the University of Maine in Orono. And this is sort of the key crime in the book. And this was alluded to a little bit after the murderer was arrested in 2001, but it had not really been fleshed out anywhere. And so once I, read about the crime in 1973, I went to Orono, did some research, looked back through the old accounts of the trial in the Bangor Daily News, talked to the state troopers there, the residents of the town, lawyers who worked on the case, and sort of put together everything from scratch.
And so to create this story, you had to read, you had told me on Saturday that police reports are not public domain. So therefore you had to piece together everything through news articles, and then from the news articles go back to the sections of the
Well, no, not quite.
no?
I said I didn't get anything officially. I was given a lot of stuff by the detectives who had just saved things and, didn't mind FedExing them to me. They kept it because they felt that the documents were important. And then once I came calling, they thought I should have it because they got invested in the quality of the book. But, the lawyers that oversee the FOIL process in the different states certainly had no interest in cooperating with me.
Oh, they did not.
No, it's not in their interest for me to see documents like this.
Even though you're writing a book about an investigation that,
Especially because I'm writing a book.
hmm,
Nobody wants you to see how the sausage is made. And in the book, I write about false leads. I write about mistakes they made. In the end, they ended up solving the case. But, the law enforcement agencies, whether it be the NYPD or the New Jersey State Police, would prefer you not to know this stuff.
yeah, there was that gentleman who was given the orange juice and he was drugged. And didn't he was one that brought the killer right to the detective's feet.
No,
And then they didn't.
this
they
was
put him
this
in a
was
trial?
this was a bench trial in Staten Island in 1990, I believe. And no, this case never really saw the light of day because it was a bench trial and resulted in an acquittal. But luckily, the transcript for the trial had been preserved and was an exhibit in the murder trial many years later. And so a clerk in the prosecutor's office in Ocean County found the transcript for me. But no one had ever looked at it.
So this was almost like needles in haystacks in a way, that you were sort of coming upon information about this killer. And how many years was it from the beginning of the very first body or parts of body that was found till, sort of the end with, who was it? Michael Sakara?
So
How many years was that before the trial?
Well, so there was a murder, of course, in 1973, which resulted in an acquittal. He was almost certainly guilty of another murder in Florida in 1982. Then the first of the known New York victims was Peter Anderson in 1991. Tom Mulcahy was 1992. Anthony Marrero was in 1993. And then Michael Sakara was also in 1993. But those are only the victims that we know about. There were, I would not be shocked if there were dozens more.
The detectives think possibly there were more?
They don't have any doubt, because the bodies of the men in New York were just discovered by accident. And,
Mhm.
It was a coin flip.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to bring in your editing team, if I may.
Also, I just want to say hi to
Oh, yes.
my publicist, who I see is lurking, Heather.
Heather is lurking.
Yes, she's a really good publicist, so I just want to say hi.
Oh, hi, Heather. I want to say hi to her too. Thank you, Heather, for having Elon with us today. So Diane and Hank, you were tasked to please edit this book. You read it. I don't know, how many times did you read the book as it was being produced?
Uh, Basically, we read the book in two stages. First, chapter by chapter. Every time Elon produced a chapter, we'd read it. And sometimes we'd read it again, you know, if he made some what he felt were major changes. And the second was when the entire manuscript was finished, he had us copy edit it. And he asked me to do that at the beginning of my vacation. So I spent the vacation looking at a screen, just typing. Thank you, Elon. And
He warned me you'd say that.
oh, he did. He did.
Yes, he did.
Okay. I just want to hasten to add that during the editing process, Elon had other people who were editing it also, who are more accomplished than we are, and more credentialed than we are. But he did ask us to look at it. During the editing process, I was really impressed by two things. Reading, first time, but a second time or a third time, I was impressed by sort of fanatical attention to facts. He really wanted to get things, right. Things that I might have just said, hey, let's just pass over that. But no, he wanted to get everything right. And the second thing was that Elon was insistent that the book be dignified and give dignity, especially to those people who were murdered and the murdered people's families. And I thinking, as someone who's marketing terms, I said, hey, why don't we jazz this up a little bit? And Elon would always say, no. Just want to make sure it's always dignified. We in real life, Elon and I often disagree. That carried over into the editing of the book. Okay, but it was great working with him. Eventually, we began to really, figure out how to agree on things. So enjoyable. It was an enjoyable exercise.
Well, you touched upon a truly remarkable, I mean, I too, when reading it, saw that this was, I don't know whether to say it was a reportage or an investigation type of, because it was very clean of not putting in personal thoughts, that Elon was not going to make comment on what was being, what he was reporting. He wanted to keep the facts in there so that nobody was getting slighted, and that it was just the facts that people were finding out about, which was riveting. And also it was less distracting. Sometimes you'll have these type of reportage, investigatory crime, true crime novels, and people will also bring comment of them and their thoughts, and also sort of what's happening in their life, and sort of it does, as you were saying, Hank, jazz it up. But Elon, you really chose not to do that. Beyond what your father had said, can you remark more about this style of writing that you did for this particular book?
Well, I don't really care about my own participation in the story and my own thoughts on the subject, so I didn't think that the reader should either. And I know it's common practice to do it, but I felt that I wanted to write the book that I wanted to read. And if that, meant doing something a little different, then that was okay with me. And if that meant that the reader was not having their expectations met, that's fine too.
It's not a book written to sensationalize anything. It's just to talk about the crimes that had happened, and you go into detail about the families that the victims were of, and you interviewed the families, you interviewed the friends, you interviewed the bartenders, the piano players at the townhouse bar. You really, that was the essence of personal that you chose to put in for the people, which actually did make the people resonate so much stronger than having your lens put on it. It's just you're learning about these people, reading about them. Of all the victims, they all had such a quiet way about them. They were not risky people necessarily. They were, and so what would you say about why the police think that there are more victims? Is it that there were more bars where this was happening, where people disappeared, or why do you think the police are thinking there are more?
Well, I'd actually want to address the first part of what you said, that they actually did take quite a lot of risks. Being gay in the early 90s, either being out of the closet or in the closet, carried tremendous risk. And, to some degree, they paid the price for it. But as for why the detectives think there are so many more victims, it's because they know how improbable it was that the bodies surfaced at all. If one of the bags hadn't been a little too heavy and a sanitation worker had not had trouble lifting it, or if another bag, hadn't been, thick enough, and so another sanitation worker, could see some of the blood pooling. There were all sorts of little twists of fate that, had they not happened, these men would probably still be classified as missing persons, if at all.
Did you have to kind of edit out a lot? Were there any parts of your research that just you were sad that it didn't make the book, or
Not really. I mean, I did edit out a lot. I took out far more than I ever put in, because every time I went through a chapter, if I thought that there was something that, even if it was interesting, if it didn't need to be there, I took it out. You can't really get sentimental about anything that you're writing, even if it took you weeks or months to report it out. And a lot of that stuff, disappeared. But I think I know it was the right decision because I don't really remember what I took out.
Mm-hmm. Now, the gay community, you write about how they formed coalitions to help the police departments help find this killer.
Well, I would object to that. They did not form groups to help the cops.
Well, they had formed, and then the police were finally in conference with them to discuss the murders.
They consulted with them.
They went out to let everyone know that the last call killer was out there. I guess that is the awareness of him. But can you talk a little bit more about those two groups that?
Well, so the Anti-Violence Project was a group that was started in Chelsea in 1980, and they were, formed because the cops did not take anti-queer violence seriously, and the courts didn't take it seriously either. They didn't know how to handle it. They didn't know how to, the district attorney's offices in the 5 boroughs didn't know how to prosecute it. And So it also became a sort of a hub for, calls were coming in about, incidents of anti-gay violence, and they were tabulating all these different instances. And, finally, certainly by the late 80s, it had become something of an establishment organization, and they began helping like the Manhattan district attorney, deal with the gay panic defense. They tutored John F. Kennedy Jr., who was an ADA, under Robert Morgenthau. And but one of the things that the organization did is they would bring awareness to both the public and the police when there were, different spurts of violence. And they specifically worked on these cases, trying to beat the bushes and put up flyers everywhere. And, I think at one point effigies made, with red paint. And, they did everything they could to get people to give a damn.
And that's where David Grand says this is such a great history book of a time of American history.
Yeah, well, David was a line editor on the book, so he knows it about as well as anybody. And to the extent that the book is written well, he's certainly a big part of it.
You had mentioned that, just in what you had said just a little earlier, that the judges didn't know how, or the lawyers didn't know how to prosecute these cases. Was it they didn't know how to prosecute because they were in different jurisdictions? Is that
No, I wasn't referring.
Prosecute because of the gay.
I wasn't referring to these cases in particular. I was saying that they didn't know how to prosecute cases of anti-gay violence, because so often the defense would use what they called the gay panic defense. And then there were different components to this defense, but essentially what it meant is that the defense could claim that so-and-so came on to me, and so I killed him, but I was justified. It was a type of justification, and the courts didn't really know what to do with this. As for why these murders that I write about were not prosecuted, or not all of them, it was jurisdictional issues. Eventually 2 of the murders were tried in New Jersey, and that's because the bodies were left there. But because they never found a crime scene, jurisdiction was dictated by where the bodies were left.
And that was something new? That was a kind of a...
No, I think that's probably pretty standard.
Is that? Okay. Yeah. I was wondering if you wanted to read a portion of your book.
Sure. So this is a scene in a bar in the West Village called the Five Oaks. It's a piano bar, and it's about a meeting between 2 men, one who will be a murder victim, and the other a murderer. July 29th, 1993. It had been a slow Thursday night at the Five Oaks, the little bar at 49 Grove Street in Greenwich Village. Lisa Hall, a short, mouthy blonde who acted and sang, was behind the bar. An off-duty bartender, Barbara Ross, sat in front. At 10:30, regulars filed in for a birthday party. Among them were Dominic, a bisexual man who split time between Manhattan and Allentown, Pennsylvania, Richard, an ex-dancer who owned a furniture store, and Sal, who owned a travel agency. Greg sat at the bar too. He was friends with Hall and was there to see her. There was little room even to stand. Marie Blake was on the piano and the patrons were singing. It was boisterous and loud, Greg recalled. The Oaks, founded by Bill Norman in the late 40s, had long been known for its menu. A gustatory delight, reported the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Its music, Nina Simone, it was rumored, accompanied customers on the piano. And as a sanctuary. Since the bar's inception, Norman's wife, May, cultivated a local crowd of queer regulars, mostly couples. At the century's midpoint and for many years thereafter, it was dangerous for gays and lesbians even to hold hands in public, so the basement establishment, without so much as a window, virtually invisible from the outside, provided a measure of protection. In 1976, Norman sold the Five Oaks to a trio of semi-regulars. Tom Regan, a professor of chemical engineering, and his wife Ginger not only lacked bar and restaurant experience, they didn't even live in New York, but they were young and loved the city. So they uprooted, refinanced the house, and went into business with Jeremy Burrell, who'd worked for the restaurant Serendipity 3. Burrell ran the front of the house, and Tom, whose professional life had been one of exactitude, kept a ruthless eye on the books. Tom and Burrell convinced waiters and bartenders in the theater district to send crowds downtown to the Five Oaks when their bars closed at midnight or so. In the early days, great business was done between 1 and 4 a.m. The new owners didn't tamper with their customer base, although the bar attracted straight people, typically devoted to Marie. The business's bread and butter was middle-aged and older gay men, grateful for a safe, warm, non-cruisy place to enjoy dinner and a drink. Tom, in fact, soon realized he was among their number. After several years, he came out of the closet, sold his share of the bar, and left Ginger. At 11:30 p.m., Paul belted out a few songs, including Peter Allen's Ode to Ending a Relationship Before It Withers, I'd Rather Leave While I'm in Love. Ross, the off-duty bartender, became upset about something and went home. By 1 o'clock, the birthday guests were gone. Then Ross called. She had left her apartment keys at the duplex a couple of blocks away, but before retrieving them, planned to stop by the Oaks again. She was greeted by an old friend, a big bearded regular well over 6 feet and 200 pounds named Michael Sakara. Michael, it was often said, was to the Five Oaks what Norm was to Cheers. Every night except Mondays, when he didn't come to the bar, Michael ordered round upon round of Cutty Sark and water. The last stool at the end of the horseshoe bar was his. From that vantage, facing the street, he could see everyone coming down the entrance steps. He sang the same song at the end of the evening and acted as the social director, making introductions. I spent more time with him than anybody else in the world at that point in my life, Hall would testify. Having worked at the Five Oaks on and off for more than a decade, she had known Michael since 1976, and across the years they'd become close. From 2 o'clock to 2:30 a.m., the only people seated at the bar were Michael and Ross, who read his horoscope, as was her custom. They bickered like siblings. She was worried about him that he drank too much, which was true. He could down 3 scotches in an hour. Michael thanked Ross for her concern and offered to retrieve her keys. This was unusual. It was not his practice to leave the bar before closing. Michael was gone no more than 10 minutes, and when he returned with the keys, Ross left. It was the early hours of July 30th, and the Five Oaks was mostly empty. Marie Blake, half an eye on the entrance, was still playing. Last call was soon at 3:45. Around this time, Michael would usually walk over to the piano and ask Blake to play a number about romantic nostalgia. The song by Sammy Fain and Irving Kahal had been popular during World War II, but more recently was embraced by Liberace. It began, I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. The bar officially closed for the night in 15 minutes, but patrons could stay to finish their drinks. This was later than most restaurants in the area, so bartenders too would stop by for a round after their own shifts ended. Shortly before last call, a man descended the 13 steps and entered the bar. He sat to Michael's immediate left and requested the house scotch and water. Hall sized him up, white guy, maybe 5'9", average build, wore a button-down shirt and had his sleeves rolled up. She guessed he was in his early 30s and would, when questioned by detectives, remember his thick, wavy hair and, quote, brown, glassy eyes. Other patrons had seen the man around the bar and had even gone home with him. Hall, though, didn't recognize it. But she assumed he and Michael knew each other. Why, after all, would you sit next to a stranger in a near-empty bar? Hall, in fact, would later speculate that perhaps they'd run into each other at the duplex. "This is Mark the nurse," Michael said, ordering a scotch and water. "He works at St. Vincent's." The men talked, but Hall couldn't hear the conversation. The nurse seemed drunk. Hall was wary of the man, as she was of any new customer who came in just before closing time. There was an increased chance of being robbed by a late arrival. Still, she was grateful Michael had company. She loved him, but he required a lot of attention. Thank God, she thought, he has someone to talk to now. Sitting nearby was an editor for the New York Times. He came to the Five Oaks twice a month, venturing downtown after work. Preparing to move out of the city, he had come to say his goodbyes. The newsman knew Michael and could see he was lost in conversation. Engrossed in their own little world is how he described it years later. He also knew the man talking to Michael, having gone to college with him in the 1970s. They'd run into each other in September at the townhouse and had crossed paths a few times since. But he let the two men be and said nothing. Hall had a lot of work to do and turn her back to the bar so she could wash glasses, count money, and take inventory. She carefully wrote down the bottles she'd used that night. Peripherally, she could see Michael and the nurse still in deep conversation. It was finally time for last call. A dozen new customers had arrived, maybe more. If you bought a drink between 2 and 4 in the morning, you got a second one free, so Hall was busy. "This is it," Hall announced. "I want everything," replied Michael, which is what he always said. He downed 12 scotches already and had eaten nothing. Sometimes he and Hall shared a dinner, but not tonight. As for the nurse, he professed to be done for the evening on account of having to drive home. But then he changed his mind and ordered another scotch and water. Hall noticed he hadn't finished the first drink, so she watered the second with ice. Just after 4 o'clock, Hall counted her tips and took the candles off the bar. She grabbed Michael's leather briefcase from the cubbyhole where he always stowed it. As Hall placed it on the bar, she noticed condoms inside. That was strange. Michael wasn't the type for one-night stands and had been until recently in a long-term monogamous relationship. 15 minutes later, Hall and Marie Blake left the Five Oaks, got into a cab together, and flew up the west side of Manhattan.
That was a great one to read. Because one of the things that's so juxtaposed with all the amazing reporting, investigative kind of reporting and writing that you do, is also then when you have sat down to talk with the regulars at the bar or the bartenders, or especially the piano players, they tell you this scene, this amazing, very kind of a caring scene of people at a bar, and they know each other and they care for each other and they sort of watch for each other. And
Most of that scene, though, for the record, didn't come from the people who were in the room, at least not directly. A lot of that was actually, to their credit, pieced together by investigators after the murder. They went back to the Five Oaks and they interviewed dozens of people to figure out who was there that night. And, I have 5 pages of handwritten notes or typed up notes that actually lay it out in detail. I mean, there was some court testimony too that added to that. And of course, I interviewed the bartender herself, and then some of the people whose names were mentioned in the police reports. But most of the work on that had already been done.
wow. And so when it was found out that it was a male nurse, I thought it was Mount Sinai, but you just said St. Vincent's.
Well, sure, he lied to people.
Oh. And then what was interesting is the detectives were finding out his work schedule, and they found there was a strong correlation between someone that was taking days off and then the bodies would appear.
yeah, they figured out his work schedule only after they caught him.
Oh,
Yeah, they they didn't really have that to work with at the time. So that would be another 8 years.
8 years.
There was 8 years between the murder of Michael Sakara, who was in that scene, and the arrest.
What was the defining thing that finally sort of everybody said it's this guy? I'm trying to remember from the book. There was so
Oh, I mean, that was pure happenstance too. You know, the murderer had committed the crime in 1973, and so of course when he was arrested in Maine, he had his fingerprints taken,
oh, that was the link.
and by state troopers, or at the county jail. And so years later, when a fingerprint analyst in Maine, was sent fingerprints from New Jersey from these murders, she was able to match it to this crime in 1973, and that's what identified him. If the fingerprint in 1973 hadn't been pristine, he never would have been caught.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other book projects underway that are crime related that are, I mean, this was such a big, you said it took 3 years to put this together, read everything and get the whole thing together. Was this,
No, I don't even have any non-crime related book projects.
and so is this something, was your biggest project to date of just research? Because I know you have a lot of your articles that are very research oriented, but was this the biggest project of trying to piece together everything? And
Oh yeah, by far. I mean, before this, I think I'd only written 1 or 2 features that were more than 4,000 or 5,000 words. So writing a book was a stretch.
are you looking for another project? Or are you just wanting to do articles for a while? It's just something that it's just something that kind of came to you and you're like, oh, I'm going to look into a little bit more.
No, I'd love to write another book, but you need to find a story that will sustain 60 or 70,000 words, and not too many of them will.
Yeah. I'm looking to see if anyone has questions. You're welcome to go ahead and put it in either the Q&A or the chat. I don't see any questions right here, so go ahead and ask any questions that you have. Oh, I just lost my chat. There we go. What impressed you most about doing this type of research? Was it talking with detectives, or talking with family members, or talking with people who knew the victims?
I mean, in all cases, people who knew the victims were always my favorite people to talk to. Even though those interviews were probably the most emotionally difficult because they were closest to them, but they always had the most important information from my perspective.
Mm-hmm. And then the detectives, I mean, did this change a lot of just police work, detective work? Certainly changed with the anti-hate, to the gay community. They were beginning to look more closely at things.
I don't think these murders and the investigations had any effect at all on how police work was conducted at the time. I think that when investigations have an effect, have an effect on investigations or anything else, it's because they've gotten so much attention that people pay attention to it, and you can't help but change your behavior, your routine. And since this didn't, there was no reason for the NYPD to change how they operated.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't matter in the slightest.
We have a question, someone who unfortunately came a little bit late. She was just, how did you first hear about these murders? It was in 1994, you said, an article?
Yeah,
And what was the publication?
The Advocate, which was probably, was and still is the most prominent gay newspaper.
And so that was 1994, but you started writing this 3 years ago. What sort of reinvigorated you to now, way back, what is it that now, 2018, to write the proposal?
Well, it was probably late 2016 when I discovered the story. In 2017 when I started the proposal. I mean, it really was as simple as the more I researched the story, the more I realized it was too big for a feature. And so it had to be a book if it was going to get told at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you were to write a prologue to this book, what would you focus on in the prologue?
Hard to say because I didn't have any interest in writing a prologue. I just wanted the story to begin and not have any throat clearing. So I didn't think about it at all.
And so your whole, the prologue you thought would have just diverted from just getting right into the story, get right into.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessary.
Mm-hmm. In your epilogue, or was it an epilogue, or?
Yeah, there was an epilogue, and
it was the only time that you really got into the book.
Yeah, and that was all owed to my editor. He wanted me to do it. I didn't want to do it, but I wasn't going to fight him on it, and it was a great idea. And he wanted me to bring the story sort of into the present day and to give the readers a little bit of a sense of what had happened since the end of the trial. And so that's what I did.
Mm-hmm. Were you affected emotionally by your work and by your discovery?
I mean, not as much as you might think. I mean, certainly I thought about it every day and it weighed on me. And there were certain sections that were very difficult, emotionally difficult to write, like the chapter I was reading from. But it wasn't, despite the bleakness of the subject matter, it wasn't difficult to do because I always talked to people that I admired every day, and talking to these remarkable people, even if it was about something horrible, was always an inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't get weighed down too much.
Is there anything that haunts you about this story? Are there questions you still have that you didn't answer?
Oh, tons. I didn't get nearly as much information as I wanted on Anthony Marrero, who was the third victim. And I don't know who the other victims are. I mean, with any story that takes place over this long period of time, you're always going to have more unanswered questions than answered. I can't even imagine what I don't know.
Are there possibly short articles of new information that you might find out that you would want to do?
I mean, maybe, but it would have to be pretty monumental for me to want to revisit it for publication.
Mm-hmm. I mean, after this book, I mean, maybe there might be an editor out there of a magazine that might say, if you do find out anything more, I mean, would an editor be interested in that?
Maybe. They're welcome to contact me.
Okay, editors, there you go. There's an idea. So another question, were you affected emotionally by, oh no, we already talked about that one, didn't we? What has been the reaction to the book from friends and families of the victims?
That I've heard from, positive.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that's a little self-selecting. The family members that I was in touch with wanted to cooperate, were cooperating with the book. And so I had, talked to them a fair amount. And, they also knew what was coming. I don't think anything, I read sections of the book to them as much as I could. I didn't want them blindsided. But I have no idea what, family members I wasn't already in touch with think about this. I have to assume that they don't like the book, and for good reason, because I'm just digging up old stories and they would just as soon forget it.
Are you getting the interest from other people saying, oh, you should write about this crime that has been happening out in Arizona, or this crime over here? Or are you getting people that are saying, hey, you did such a great job with this book. Can you write about these investigations? I mean,
yeah, well, I think anytime somebody writes something in any genre, the instinct is for people to say, okay, do another one. I mean, in this case, I have heard from investigators, saying, oh, I worked on this case in 1986. I think it might be similar. You might want to look into this. That's pretty common. I've heard from, retired FBI agents and people like that. And, that's fine. I'm just glad that they're reading it.
because this took so long to investigate, and sort of the lack of attention from the police, are family members, do they have a sense of respect from the authorities or not regarding how the investigations were done and that it took so long?
I mean, I think that they're, grateful that it was ultimately, the case was ultimately closed, but I can't imagine that they're happy that it took so long. Didn't need to. But I don't know.
Mhm.
I never,
Heard from
I
them.
hadn't asked them about that. But, they have no reason to be happy about it.
A question from Virginia asks, after working on this story about a serial killer, does it make you pause when someone comes up and sits next to you at a bar?
I haven't been in a bar in like a year and a half.
Well, that's true. None of us have.
But if I went to a bar, I don't think I'd be, I think I'd probably be okay with it. I mean, that's half the reason to go to a bar, to talk to people.
Yeah. Just don't, I don't know.
And I don't go home with people anymore because I'm married.
So here's a person who has not finished the book, but did you get insight into the reasons of the murderer, which they have not found out any reasons why, have they?
Detectives had their theories, but nothing that they felt terribly strongly about. And, because nobody really knew why he did it, I didn't feel compelled to write about it. I know that that's the kind of thing people sort of look for. They always want to know what the motive is, but I don't think that's terribly interesting.
I thought that there was a part in the book that you did say he just hasn't told us why he does it. He just,
Well, I mean, he never confessed, so of course he wasn't going to talk about why he did what he did.
Mhm. Let's see, Melanie is asking, what year was the trial and what year were the conviction? Was the murdered convicted of all 4 victims?
No, he was only tried on the 2 victims that were left in New Jersey. He was sorry, he was arrested in 2001. The trial started in 2005, and he was convicted or sentenced in 2006, and has been in New Jersey State Prison ever since.
And have you gone to visit him there by any chance?
No, he doesn't want to see me. He didn't return my letters, and he rejected my requests to talk to him in person, which was fine. I didn't have tons of questions for him anyway.
Other than why did he do it, but
No, wasn't even going to ask him that, because if he doesn't confess to something, I can't very well ask him why he did it.
Mm,
It was mostly just questions about his, childhood that I was curious about, because I thought he
mhm.
might at least be honest there.
Do you know that he was a perpetual liar? I mean, of course, he was a murderer, but was that something that came out in the trials? He was
Well, I mean, if he murdered people and said he didn't, I have to assume he's a liar on some level.
and therefore on many levels. Yeah.
I mean, maybe. I mean, I didn't hear stories from friends and acquaintances saying that they had found him to be dishonest when they knew him. But this is probably a good place to draw the line if you're going to be lying about something.
Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions, anyone? Diane and Hank, do you want to come back on and have anything you'd like to say before we close out? We're up to our hour almost.
Well, there's a question there from Virginia.
Let's see, where is this one? I've not finished the book.
Did the killer have a solid work history? And the answer is yes. By all accounts, he was an
Yeah.
excellent nurse. There were no red flags there.
He was actually, yes, he was stellar. I remember, yeah. And he worked for dozen years, 15 years.
More than that, he by the
Yeah.
time he was arrested, he'd been on staff at Mount Sinai Hospital for 22 years.
I'm sorry, Hank, did you want to say something?
The only last thought I might have is simply that reading Elon's book did not increase our confidence in law enforcement and the ability of law enforcement to find murders, especially murders that are essentially motiveless.
Mm. Yeah. Elon, do you have one last thing you want to just say about the book before we sign off?
Not about the book, but about my writing partner on the first part of the book. I write about her in the acknowledgments. Her name was Lyra McKee, and she was a journalist in Northern Ireland who was murdered a few years ago while she was covering an incident with police. And for a time, she was probably the most famous journalist in the world. And we were working on books at the same time. We had the same due date. And so she should be here for this. And I'll never not be upset that she isn't. But yeah, I write about her a little bit in the acknowledgments. And she's got, there was a book of hers released posthumously, but she never finished the book she was working on.
What is the name of that book?
I don't know it offhand, but it was published by Faber and Faber in the UK, where she was under contract.
Mm.
They published an anthology of hers.
Mm-hmm. That is sad to hear. And she helped you with the first part of the book, just all the investigations.
No, I mean, we would send each other drafts of our chapters.
Oh, I see.
And so I read her work and she read mine, and then we would chat.
That's very sad to hear. Elon, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
The book is The Last Call. Probably your copy is better than mine because I don't have the here. There it's not. Last Call, True Story, Love, Lust, and Murder in Queer New York. It's a wonderful, a tough read about a tough situation, tough things that happened back in the 90s. Well documented. Thank you, Elon, very, very much for this book.
Thanks for having me.
Diane and Hank for being with us. And thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. I appreciate it. Everyone have a very good night.